History 1. I'm a 23-year-old woman on the verge of graduating from college with a degree in criminal justice. My coursework revolves around understanding the government, court systems, criminology, and police operations. Yet the most intriguing aspect of my education has been the elective classes available for my degree. We have around 8 different criminal justice electives, and I've taken quite a few of them. One of the most fascinating and unsettling was sex crimes, a class full of disturbing yet enlightening content. However, my favorite elective has been Homeland Security with Dr. Smith, a pseudonym for privacy. Dr. Smith is the kind of man you'd never peg for a former cop. He has a thin build, wears thick glasses, and speaks in a soft manner that belies his tough past. He took a liking to me, probably because I was the only woman in the class and actively participated in discussions. One day, just before our finals, I asked him about his most memorable experience as a police officer. Hrev de TNTMs, the story he shared with our class, which included a bunch of guys and one very intrigued 23-year-old woman. It was the late 1980s, and Dr. Smith was fresh out of the academy, partnered with a seasoned officer named John. John had been in the force for about 15 years and was there to guide the rookie Dr. Smith. They were patrolling a nice neighborhood when they stopped at a sign and saw a man in his mid-30s briskly walking down the sidewalk. His attire, flip-flops, basketball shorts, and a large t-shirt, was out of place for the upscale area. John told Dr. Smith to keep an eye on him. When Dr. Smith asked why, John simply replied, "I have a bad feeling. Trust me." They followed the man, turned on the patrol car lights, and stopped him. As they got out and approached, John did most of the talking while Dr. Smith watched the man VDJTM's body language. He seemed restless but calm, continually adjusting his shorts and t-shirt. John asked if there was an issue with his clothes, to which the man replied that his shorts were a bit big. Before Dr. Smith knew it, John had the man pinned against the hood of the car, cuffing his hands. Dr. Smith was baffled and started questioning John's actions when John lifted the man VJTM shirt to reveal a Glock tucked into the waistband and a bag of cocaine in one of the pockets. The man was apparently a drug user who had received a bad batch and was on his way to confront the dealer, possibly with violent intentions. When Dr. Smith asked how John knew, John simply said, "I had a bad feeling and trusted my gut." Dr. Smith learned that day to never underestimate the power of intuition. History 2. My name's Emma, and this happened to me a couple of years ago, at the beginning of March 2022. I work the late shift, usually clocking out around 1:30 to 2 a.m. My drive home always takes me through a tunnel, the quickest route to my house. One night I was heading home as usual and noticed a car up ahead with its hazard lights on. I figured they were having car trouble, maybe a flat tire or something. As I got closer, a hooded man stepped out of the car and pointed a gun straight at me. I reacted quickly, threw my car into reverse and started backing up as fast as I could, like a scene from an action movie. Unfortunately, in my haste, I lost control and crashed the back right side of my car against the tunnel wall. Luckily, the car was still drivable, so I shifted back into drive and sped away, taking an alternate route home. I was terrified, and all I could think was, what the hell just happened? When I got home, I rushed into my room, still shaking, and tried to process what I'd just been through. I called the cops to report the incident, but everything had happened so fast that I couldn't give a good description of the car or the guy. His hood had hidden his face. I couldn't believe this had happened to me and had so many questions. Was he trying to rob me? If he had wanted to kill me, he could have pulled the trigger when he aimed the gun. Maybe he thought pointing the gun would scare me enough that he could walk up and take my phone and wallet. I told a few friends and coworkers about it. They were shocked and said I was lucky. One even suggested the gun might have been fake, but real or not, I wasn't sticking around to find out. Ever since that night, I've never taken that tunnel home again. I always take a different route now. I hope no one else fell victim to whatever that guy was planning. I didn't DJ Tummet hear of any other incidents in that tunnel, so I assume he either fled or was caught by the police. History 3. I want to start by saying I've never shared this story, but I've always wanted to. I'll be changing the names and keeping the city I'm in out of the story for safety reasons. So when I was 7, my oldest sister, who we call Sarah, started dating a guy she met at a club. We knew nothing about him other than he was from Mexico and visiting his cousin here in the U.S. He was very charming, with blue eyes, blonde hair, and he was extremely tall, just my sister's type. My mom didn't really like him and would often tell my sister not to get too attached since he was only here on a 6-month travel visa and would eventually have to go back. My sister was 18 and rebellious, so not only did she become attached, she asked him to stay past his visa. We live in a sanctuary city, so he agreed to stay. Eventually, she ended up pregnant, dropped out of college, and he moved into our home with us. He was really nice and always helped financially. He always seemed to have money and was always working in our garage. My mom was a single mom and never used the garage, so we never went in to see what he did in there. Well, eventually he rented a house a few blocks away from ours, and we were kind of shocked that he had the money for it because our neighborhood wasn't the cheapest in the city, but it was one of the safest. My mom was happy they were close, but also questioned where he got the money for this home. Time passed, and one Saturday night my sister was pounding on our door with her son. She was also pregnant with her second child and was flustered with dirt all over her arms and clothes. My mom asked her where her husband was, and that's when she told us he had been selling drugs for a cartel. Apparently, he wasn't giving them the full profit of what he was making, and they found out. They gave him a week to come up with the money, but he didn't. My sister was feeding her son in his nursery when she heard them break in and begin to beat her husband. She had her keys and diaper bag in her son's nursery, so she opened a window, jumped out, and ran to my mom's house with her baby. My mom wanted to call the police, but my sister begged her not to. We also found out that her husband would beat and cheat on her multiple times. We begged her to leave him, but she didn't want to. They ended up moving homes, and the abuse only got worse, as did the cheating. We were really worried for her, as she had just had her second child and was dealing with postpartum depression. She also told us that he no longer worked for the cartel, but we didn't believe her. We knew we couldn't help her. Some time passed, and eventually my sister told us they were moving to Mexico. We were in shock. My mom begged her not to go, and I cried to her multiple times, but her mind was made up. We were worried the abuse would only get worse there and that he would continue working for the cartels. We found out he had been using drugs throughout their entire relationship, which really worried us. The day came for them to leave, and she took a flight to Mexico with her 2 kids while he drove to Mexico to do one last job for the cartel. At the time, we had no idea this was happening, but the day before his drive, he asked to grab the tools he had left in our garage, and my mom let him. He took 2 huge duffel bags and left. 2 days later, around 2 a.m., a bunch of masked men came to our home, banging on every window, shaking our doors, and screaming for us to open up. My mom and brother called the cops, but they weren't much help. Our neighbor across the street saw everything happen, came out with his rifle, and shot it in the air. He also called the cops, and I guess his call was enough to get them to come faster, but not fast enough. I remember shaking after seeing multiple men with their own guns. Finally, we heard sirens, and all the men left in their trucks, speeding off. We called my sister to tell her what happened, and she instantly broke down, telling us her husband had been storing drugs and money in our garage. My mom was extremely pissed off and started packing our bags to stay with family. We went from family to family, but it didn't matter because they always found us. For months, we were stalked. My sister's husband was nowhere to be found. Whenever we tried to drive back home, they would show up and just watch us. Life became scary and the cops wouldn't help us. It got to the point that my mom decided to move us all to her vacation home in Mexico. She first sent my brother over with my sister and her kids as they were the most anxious. She then began the process of getting my school transcripts. During this time, my mom also sold her truck and got a small car to try and throw off the stalkers, but that didn't work. They had all of my uncle's plates at this point and knew where we were. All my aunts were telling my mom not to move to Mexico. They said we'd die there and insisted on keeping us safe. That same week, we were watching the news as we packed our bags to leave, and my sister's husband's face was on the TV screen. He was an accomplice to murder with cartel ties. What was supposed to be a 3-day job turned into tying up loose ends for the cartel he worked for. We also found out he wasn't just withholding profits but also stealing drugs from them. They told him they knew where my sister and his kids were, and if he didn't continue to do what they said, they would kill them. Once we saw he had been put in jail, we postponed our move, and slowly, everything went back to normal. We were left alone. My sister continued to live in Mexico with my brother due to anxiety, but the rest of us moved back home. A few months passed, and I was playing alone in my backyard when a red pickup truck pulled up in the alley, and they tried to take me. This actually happened 3 times. On the 3rd time, the police arrived in time and were able to arrest the man. He had ties to the cartel my sister's husband worked for. I'm not really sure what he wanted from me, but this whole situation made me develop long-term PTSD and an anxiety disorder. I now live alone with my daughter and have multiple locks and a security system in place. I hate being alone in my mother's house and avoid being there at all costs. My sister eventually divorced that man and later remarried. She's now happy and at peace. Deep down, we're all really scared that if he ever gets out of jail, it'll all start again. But I really hope that doesn't happen. History 4. I'm 24 years old now. We used to have a neighbor named Mr. Thompson, who was in his late 60s. He passed away a few years back, but while he was alive, he caused us a lot of trouble. He scratched our car, poisoned our apple trees and lawn, and even set off a firework near me that made me temporarily lose hearing in one ear when I was just 4 years old. His son was a prominent judge in town, so whenever we tried to take action, it seemed like everything was stacked against us. I remember my dad used to call from work, warning us not to be alone at home and that we should stay at Grandma's whenever possible. When I was little, around 6 or 7, I had recurring nightmares about seeing a face outside the bathroom window. The window was high above the bathtub, so no one could see inside unless they climbed onto the roof of our shed, which was right below the window. The shed was next to a fence that separated our garden from Mr. Thompson's yard. I had these nightmares almost every other night, but I never told my parents because we didn't really talk about things like that. I thought they were just dreams, nothing more. Last year, during a session with my therapist, we discussed some personal issues, and I brought up these nightmares because they seemed relevant to what we were talking about. After my session, my mom asked me what we discussed, so I told her about the dreams. To my surprise, she mentioned that I had told her I saw Mr. Thompson on the roof of our shed. I didn't remember saying that, but she insisted I had mentioned it several times. She also said that my friends, when they visited, saw him on the roof too, which made them uneasy. I never mentioned to my mom that I saw him watching me shower, but when she brought it up, it all came back to me. It made sense, and the thought still creeps me out. There was another unsettling incident when I was around 9 or 10. One evening, I went to the balcony to call my cat in. The balcony door was in my room, and I often used it for that purpose. But that night, I saw a figure standing in our garden. It was dark, so I couldn't make out who it was, but the figure was just standing there, not moving. I called out for my dad, expecting it to be him, even though it felt odd. The figure looked up at me, and despite the darkness, I could tell it wasn't my dad. My eyes had adjusted to the dark enough to see the silhouette more clearly. When I told my dad, he went downstairs to check, but the figure was gone. I went back to the balcony later and noticed Mr. Thompson's back door closing just as I looked. I don't remember if it was the next day or a few days later, but our grass turned brown, and we discovered it had been poisoned, even though most of it was out of reach from his property. History 5. I'm a 36-year-old single mother of 3, and this happened to me a few years ago. It was a chilly evening with the sun dipping low over the horizon as I pulled into our quiet suburban neighborhood after a quick trip to the gas station. The tank was now full, but a sense of uneasiness settled over me as I parked in our driveway. I glanced around, noticing the usual calm of the street, yet something felt off. As I gathered my purse and keys, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a figure quickly ducking behind a nearby hedge. My heart skipped a beat, nerves tingling as I hurried to unlock the front door. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and I shivered despite the warmth inside. I quickly checked on my 3 children, Tommy, Emily, and little Jake. All were safe, thankfully, lost in their evening cartoons, oblivious to the unease gripping me. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to a stressful day and an overactive imagination. But as I glanced out the window, a shadow darted across the yard, confirming my worst fears. The figure was tall and dark, blending into the gathering dusk. Panic surged through me, adrenaline kicking in as I locked the doors and drew the curtains. Every sound outside was amplified in my ears: the creak of the porch steps, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I started debating whether to call the police, but hesitated, unsure if I was overreacting. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional distant car passing by in the neighborhood. I finally managed to coax the children to bed, their innocent sleep a stark contrast to my racing dark thoughts. I tiptoed back downstairs, trying to reassure myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks. Surely I was just tired and paranoid, right? Well, then came a soft tapping at the living room window. My heart leaped into my throat. I crept closer, peering out cautiously. There, standing in the shadows, was Mr. Blake from 2 houses down, a man known for his odd behavior and intense stares. His eyes were fixed on me, a creepy and cold smile spreading across his face. I stumbled back in horror, knocking over a lamp that crashed to the floor. The noise startled Mr. Blake, but instead of retreating, he seemed emboldened. He gestured for me to come closer, his demeanor unsettlingly calm. "Come out, dear," he called in a low, coaxing voice. "I just want to talk." Fear paralyzed me as I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling over the emergency dial. Mr. Blake's expression darkened, his movements becoming more urgent. He paced along the edge of my yard, muttering to himself in a way that sent chills down my spine. Just as I dialed 911, I heard a loud crash from the back of the house. My heart pounded as I realized he was now trying to break in. Without hesitation, I bolted upstairs, bursting into the children's room to scoop them into my arms. We huddled together in the closet, my phone pressed to my ear as I whispered urgently to the dispatcher. Minutes felt like hours as we waited in terrified silence, my little ones crying and confused. Then finally I heard it, the sirens in the distance getting closer and closer. Relief washed over me as Mr. Blake vanished into the darkness, just as the police cars screeched to a stop outside our house. Officers flooded the area, searching for any sign of the intruder. They found Mr. Blake lurking in the bushes at the edge of our property, his face twisted in a mixture of defiance and derangement. He was arrested and taken away, but the fear lingered long after. I went through the process of getting a restraining order, but I ultimately decided to move somewhere new. So that's what I did. We moved to a much safer area where I could raise my children without the haunting specter of our creepy neighbor. Even now, years later, I can't forget the terror of that night, the feeling of being watched, the fear for my children's safety. It's a story that I rarely tell people, but one that serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the darkest threats can lurk just beyond our own front doors.